Welcome to the Practice You podcast. My name is Elena Brower. Let's dive into today's conversation regarding life's myriad transitions and how we refine our responses in our relationships, our wellness, our households, our work, and in our practices. You are invited to learn and love and listen with me. Welcome to Practice You. Welcome back to the podcast. I have a friend with me who is super well respected in this field. Her name is Sara Szal Gottfried. She is a doctor, physician, researcher, author, educator. She's a graduate of Harvard Medical School and MIT. She completed her residency at UCSF, but is more likely to prescribe a continuous glucose monitor, a personalized nutrition plan, and yoga, rather than the latest pharmaceutical. Dr. Gottfried is a global keynote speaker, author of 4 New York Times bestselling books about hormones, nutrition, and health. Her latest book is called The Autoimmune Cure. And wow, first of all, I love that you put cure right in the damn title. How great. You're so smart.
Yeah, we want to set the bar high. Set the bar high. Like it's enough already to just be masking symptoms.
Yep. In this book, Hope on the Horizon for tens of millions of people who suffer from autoimmune diseases. I do want to talk about what you think the cause of that is, but I also want to touch on what the main thread through the book is, which is the connection with trauma and autoimmune situations. You've created a powerful program designed to break this vicious cycle. So our listener, if you are in any sort of cycle where your immune system is fighting itself, listen carefully. Sarah's going to provide you with elimination diets, possible diagnostic tool to identify foods that trigger your immune system to fight when it doesn't actually need to. Nutritional modulation, 4 areas to address for the long term: nutrient gaps, poor digestion, toxic backlog, blood sugar spikes. Sleep, thirdly, how to measure your sleep in the 8 steps. Wow, to better sleep. I can't wait to go over this. Toxic stress, how to manage stress and regulate cortisol with resilience techniques that are really important and proven. Supplements. You've got black cumin, polyphenols, curcumin, resveratrol, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, and a few more. All of those should be top of our list. Breathwork, microbiome restoration, so cool. Somatic therapy, and even psychedelic therapies. Personally, I want to cover all of these over the course of this conversation. I wonder if you have a certain place to start where you feel it's really very, very important that we talk. Otherwise, we'll start with elimination diets.
The place I like to start is just the deep frustration of people who've got these mysterious symptoms and they just can't get an answer. And they often go to 4 to 7 physicians over the course of years. Some are dismissed. Some are just told that they're getting older and that's why they're tired and their joints hurt. And we just have to do better, Elena. I just feel like, folks who suffer in this way, who struggle and are failed by the medical system, there's a way to address this. There's a way to look at the root causes and turn it around. So that's where I like to start because I'm one of those people with pre-autoimmunity. I don't have an autoimmune disease, but I've got the signs of this civil war happening with my immune system in my own body. And when I saw that, and I saw just this epidemic rise in people with autoimmune conditions in my practice, I just felt like, well, that's the next book. We've got to take this on. We've got to change the conversation.
Yeah. What are the symptoms that you're experiencing, just so our listener can kind of tune in with you a little bit?
Well, my symptoms are easy to dismiss as someone who's really mission-driven and self-reliant and hyper-independent. So I've got, just kind of those vague malaise, fatigue. Even when I sleep well, I got 8 hours of sleep last night, and yet I woke up not feeling fully restored.
Wow.
I feel like I don't roll with the punches in terms of stressors like I used to. And I've got, sort of these joint aches that come and go. Doesn't seem to be associated with movement or with some of the other exercise that I do. Doesn't seem to get better with my yoga practice, which I've had for almost 50 years. So those are some of my symptoms. There's more than 100 plus symptoms of autoimmune conditions. And the main thing that I track is my anti-nuclear antibodies. So antibodies against the nucleus of the cells in my body. So I track that over time, and it's something that I use to assess the state of balance in my body, the state of homeostasis.
Is that homeocysteine measurement in the blood work?
Homocysteine is a really important measurement. It's something we use a lot in functional medicine, and it's an indicator of inflammation in the body. It's one of many different inflammatory signals. I'm talking more generally of the state of homeostasis, kind of the state of being able to, almost like a seesaw, kind of go up and down and be able to manage the process without slamming down into the ground. So homocysteine sounds like homeostasis. They're two different things.
Got it. Okay. For your own body, let's just start there. What were some of the first things that you started to do that, you'll pardon the pun, triggered your healing?
Well, it's helpful when I put on my hat as a scientist and as a physician. I think about the root causes of autoimmunity. So there's three of them. And this was first described by Alessio Fasano, who's a pediatric gastroenterologist at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. So he talked about how people have a genetic predisposition together with increased intestinal permeability, so-called leaky gut, and then third, a trigger. And that trigger could be a number of different things. It could be pregnancy, postpartum. It could be infection, such as with COVID. It could be toxic stress or some sort of traumatic event, like a divorce or a death in the family. So in my situation, I had a particular trigger when about 5 years ago, I had a falling out with a close family member. And I'd never been estranged from anyone in my family before. This really was devastating to me. And we didn't talk despite efforts on my side for about a year. And so that got me to start to look at what are the ways that trauma could be causing difficulty and conflict in this relationship. It was around the same time that we started to see some new treatments for trauma, in particular MDMA assisted therapy. And as I started to look at those studies, and I saw that they were more than twice as effective as talk therapy and the use of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, I just thought, wow, I want to try this. I want to see if this helps me clean up my side of the street. And so it was around that time that I started to look at, for people who experience trauma, how does it live on in the body? We know about some of the mental health effects, the post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, attention deficit disorder, but we know less about the physical effects. And as I started to look at, well, if trauma is living on in my body, what are some of the physical effects? And I had blood sugar problems. I had this fatigue that I just mentioned. I had these positive anti-nuclear antibodies. And I just felt like the time is now to resolve this trauma signature. So I set about learning about psychedelic assisted therapy, which I found really helpful in terms of resolving the signature of trauma in my own body. But this is less about me and really more about how can this help other people. And what I observed over this past 5 years was how many of my patients with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, with type 1 diabetes, with multiple sclerosis, psoriasis, how many of them had this trauma signature themselves. And of course, not everyone with autoimmune disease has a history of trauma, and not everyone who experiences significant trauma or toxic stress develops an autoimmune disease, but they are very highly correlated.
I can see that. And the trauma could be those little micro traumas that occur over the course of a woman's, for example, adult life. She starts working. She doesn't even realize she has rights in an office setting or in some sort of professional setting where for 10 or 20 years she just takes on these small traumas. They build up in her body. It could also be that. So many of us have had that.
It's such an important point because a lot of people think of trauma as being, this catastrophic event, surviving the 9/11 bombings or experiencing a genocide. But in some ways, the type of trauma matters less than the way it lives on in the body. And you're right. I mean, I would say we know that women experience more trauma than men do. And it's often, sort of our interface with the environment, like in the workplace, where those small t traumas can continue to live on in the body and lead to some of these mysterious symptoms.
Yeah. I see that with a lot of my friends who are struggling. And a few years ago, I caught it in some of my own blood work in my body. And I started to really take my meditation practice seriously, supplementation practice seriously, weight training practice seriously, all the things that I felt could and might help. And they all did. I want to go back to the list. And I think elimination diets are pretty self-explanatory. Our listener can tune into what that would feel like, eliminating wheat, dairy, sugar, whatever vegetables, nightshades, whatever you think might be causing it, and then doing the things that you don't think could be causing it, seeing how that works. But nutritional modulation, the 4 areas that you speak of to address for the long term, the nutrient gaps, the poor digestion, toxic backlog, blood sugar spikes, we could be on for 4 hours talking about these things. For myself, the blood sugar spikes turned out to be a big deal, and I had to seriously modulate that. I can't have even dark chocolate unless I have some form of protein, either legumes or eggs or otherwise, because I can see how even dark chocolate gives me a little spike. And what those spikes do in terms of, it's almost like stretching a rubber band many, many, many times until the rubber band gets frayed and finally breaks. Can you explain that for our listeners so that they can really get a handle on what a blood sugar spike does in a system, especially when it's happening multiple times a day?
Yeah, blood sugar excursions, or these spikes that you're talking about, are really detrimental to the human body. And let's take it one step further. It seems to be detrimental to women at a lower level of glucose than it is in men. So a lot of the cutoffs between normal, healthy blood sugar and prediabetes, which is something that I have, and diabetes, a lot of those cutoffs were defined in men, not in women. And what's happened over the past few decades is that we're learning that for women who've got a fasting glucose in the prediabetes range, so that's from 100 to 125 milligrams per deciliter, those women have early vascular changes to their blood vessels that we don't necessarily see in men. So women have more vulnerability. Once again, I sometimes say that it's a health hazard to be female. We really have to solve this. We have to understand the ways in which women are more vulnerable, and they're not just small versions of men. And with the blood sugar spikiness, it's really the spikiness, as you described, that's the problem. So we're meant to be in a state of relative homeostasis, a state of balance with glucose. We're meant to have an average glucose of about 100 milligrams per deciliter or less, and not too much spikiness. So scientifically, you could describe that as variability or a standard deviation that's less than 15 milligrams per deciliter. But what happens when you spike beyond that? So say you have some chocolate and it spikes your glucose up to 200 and it stays there for a while, or maybe you also have some adrenal dysregulation and your cortisol's not quite right. You then drop way too low and then you feel tired and maybe a little shaky. So those spikes up and down can cause damage to your delicate blood vessels. And some even feel like the damage to the blood vessels is an autoimmune reaction because your body is attacking your blood vessels, triggered by the spikiness of glucose. So that's the main problem. It produces inflammation. It starts to attack your blood vessels. It leads to things like high blood pressure later on. It leads to coronary heart disease, which is something that women develop a little later than men, but we actually don't survive it as well as men do. There have been a lot of advances for men in terms of heart disease, the number one killer, but less so for women. So that's what happens with blood sugar spikes, which are really important to link to toxic stress and to trauma. We know that people who have adverse childhood experiences have a greater risk of developing blood sugar problems and even diabetes as they get older.
Yeah, I had, I think my last level was like a 6, and it should be somewhere below 5.5. So I'm just trying to work on getting that down, which is fun. It's a fun challenge.
It is a fun challenge.
Yeah, I'm cool with it. Like, it's nice to know what I'm working toward and taking chromium and doing all the things that I should be doing. Of the nutrient gaps, poor digestion, and toxic backlog, what do you think is the most important for you and I to discuss right now for our listener?
I would say the nutrient gaps. I feel like especially post-pandemic, a lot of people don't realize that if you've experienced COVID, we know that it depletes you almost across the board of the nutrients in your body. And you may not realize that your vitamin D is much lower than it needs to be to serve in its 400 functions that it has in your body, including helping you with your gut integrity and helping to prevent that increased intestinal permeability that's associated with developing autoimmunity. So I would say nutrient gaps are really critical to understand. This is where eating a food plan, and as you described, I talk about a particular way to do an elimination provocation diet in the book, which is really well proven to help you be less sensitized to the foods that you're eating and reduce the inflammatory response in your body. So you want to be eating ideally about 5 to 7 different colors a day. That helps to fill those micronutrient gaps that you develop. And then I think this is somewhat obvious for a lot of us, but checking your vitamin D and tracking that over time. A lot of people get their vitamin D checked once. It's low. And so they start taking a vitamin D supplement and then they don't check it again. We want to be tracking it over time to make sure it's in that optimal range of about 60 to 90. So that's the target that I have in my medical practice with the clients that I work with.
That's a good one. Talk to us about black cumin.
Black cumin is so interesting. There's a number of randomized trials now, 3 to 4, showing that when you use black cumin, and we're talking here about a culinary dose of it. So when you use black cumin, it helps to reduce the autoimmunity of Hashimoto's. So many people have Hashimoto's thyroiditis where they are attacking their normal thyroid tissues. And you can track this with a couple of measures. You can look at thyroid peroxidase antibodies in the blood. You can also look at anti-thyroid globulin. These are antibodies that your body makes in a case of mistaken identity where your immune system is sending out these weapons, these antibodies to attack your own tissues. And black cumin has been shown to help to reduce these antibodies and to help the thyroid function better. So it's one of those natural treatments that I typically start with first, especially in a client that I'm taking care of who's got positive antibodies, but their TSH, their thyroid stimulating hormone, the main control hormone for their thyroid function, is still relatively normal. So that's where I like to use black cumin.
How should we take that? Is that the liquid form, capsules? What do you prefer to use for delivery?
So The randomized trials were published before there was a supplement available with black cumin. And there might be some black cumin seed that you can get as a supplement now. There's certain supplement companies that I tend to use that have good manufacturing practices and are quite reliable in terms of what's on the label is actually in the supplement, the pill or capsule that you're taking. With black cumin seed, what I do with my clients, at least what I have for the last 5 years, is I have them get organic black cumin seeds at their local health food store or online, and then to grind them and then, consume it on a salad or, mix it in with a smoothie. So I like the culinary approach. That's what I found to be the most helpful, and that's what's in the randomized trials.
That's so helpful. Talk to us a little bit about polyphenols, curcumin, resveratrol.
Food has about 50,000 molecules in it, and some of the most beneficial molecules are polyphenols. So I'm a big fan of making sure that your diet is polyphenol rich. The way you do that is really to pay attention to the colors. So I can tell you what I had for breakfast this morning was some sheep's yogurt with berries. I had a mix of strawberries and raspberries and blackberries and blueberries. And I also had some pink lady apple. And so that alone is about 4 different colors that I've gotten, a rich source of polyphenols. And we know that one of the most important effects of eating foods with vivid color is that it really supports your immune system. So you're not going to get that from packaged food. You're not going to get it from ultra processed food. You get it from whole foods. And so really paying attention to the number of colors that you eat each day is so good for the immune system.
Yeah. Wonderful. With regards to curcumin and resveratrol, what are the best ways that we can get those two supplements into our bodies?
Well, you could always go to the food source. I've got a food first approach. So I love to cook with turmeric, which is a rich source of curcumin. It's such an important anti inflammatory in the body, probably one of the richest that we have. But I can also tell you it stains your fingers, it stains your cutting board, and sometimes it's a little easier to take it as a supplement. So I typically prescribe it as a supplement to my patients and then encourage them to drink golden milk and to get other sources of turmeric besides just supplement form and to mix it up. So that's typically the combination that I recommend. And when it's not easy to cook with turmeric or to drink, like a golden milk latte, then that's where you want to take the supplement.
Okay, cool. I think this is on everyone's mind. The microbiome restoration is a big conversation. It's obviously very personal and particular to each human. I've had everything from parasites to leaky gut, even SIBO, which I've fixed with herbs, supplements, and awareness. What are you typically seeing in your autoimmune patients regarding their microbiome, and what are you teaching through your book, The Autoimmune Cure, regarding this?
Microbiome restoration is a complex topic. It's not a quick fix. And as you probably know from dealing with parasites and what sounds like dysbiosis, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and leaky gut, it's a project. It's something that you've got to commit to, and there's usually multiple phases to it. So I've been doing microbiome restoration for about the past decade in my clients. And what I see with patients who've got autoimmunity is number one, they've got reduced diversity of the microbiome. So just kind of the range of bacteria and other microbes that they have in their gut is not as broad as you would want. So there's reduced diversity. There's often dysbiosis, an imbalance of the microbes in the gut. And there are certain bacteria that are associated with a greater risk of autoimmune disease. So we can measure those. We can do a stool test and measure those. And then, of course, the increased intestinal permeability. I used to test for that in my patients, starting like 20 years ago. And I do less testing now. I just sort of assume that pretty much anyone with autoimmune disease has increased intestinal permeability. And in some ways, the treatment is easier and relatively low risk than the expense of doing the test and waiting for the test to come back. So I often just treat people at the start with things like L-glutamine and aloe vera. You can add that to smoothies. And I can also tell you, with my professional athletes that I take care of in my medical practice, pretty much 95% of them have leaky gut, just related to their training load, the amount of cortisol that's running through their system to play at such an elite level. And so even if you don't have any symptoms related to your gut, it's amazing to me how many people have a level of dysfunction in their gut that's kind of flying below the radar. So it's something that I think all of us need to pay attention to. But I don't have the hubris to say that I know the way to fix the microbiome. I think it's important to realize that we're still in the learning to crawl stage when it comes to what we know about the microbiome, when it comes to how to nudge it in a particular direction. And what I can share is what's worked for some of my clients and for myself. So one of my clients, a guy who's featured in the book, who developed Crohn's disease. He was a really successful professor at the University of California, San Diego. And he ended up needing surgery to repair a stricture that he had. Crohn's disease is an autoimmune disease where you're attacking, in his case, his colon. So he had a portion of his colon removed surgically, but that was a huge wake-up call for Larry. And afterwards, he did a couple of things in terms of microbiome restoration. He started to make a smoothie of 57 different fruits and vegetables. And I'm not advising that you go out and do this because it's a lot to manage that many fruits and vegetables, but there was something about the species variety that he focused on. He got all the colors of the rainbow. And he would go to his local farmer's market and just get some berries and some different vegetables that were in season. And he would go home and make a smoothie out of it. And he would make enough for a week. And he would freeze 6 ounces and drink some of this each day. And he found that he was able to completely shift his microbiome within a matter of months. So he combined that. He also had some metabolic issues and he also was doing some intermittent fasting. But the two together really seemed to be powerful for him. And in short order, his autoimmune condition was in remission and he was able to, he jokes that he became a different Larry because he shifted his microbiome so significantly.
What a wonderful story. I love hearing when people take it on. And I think if we're leaving our listener with one or two things, it's a few of these facts, some of these supplements that are really interesting and have proven out. But also not to be afraid to take it on, one little step at a time, one little choice at a time. To not stay with what's familiar, but in fact to go to your local farmer's market or co-op and ask them what is actually in season and local here if you're not aware. And start to play. We've got Google. Look up some recipes with the things that are in season. You will invariably find something that your body will love. And if things feel bland to you, this is something we've grown to do, and I wonder how you feel about this. We've started making our own gomasio, which is basically just toasted sesame seeds, no oil. Toast them up till they're, golden, and then add a little salt, grind them in the coffee grinder, and voila, put them on everything with some olive oil and everything tastes better. And it's not so much salt necessarily, but it does help with steamed vegetables, grains, and so forth, to legumes, to just bring out a little more flavor.
Yeah, I love that.
You do. I'm so glad.
Yes.
I'm so glad to hear this.
I love gomassia, but I also would say there are some people with autoimmune disease who find that nuts and seeds are actually a trigger for them.
Oh, wow.
And so this is where doing some experimentation can be really helpful. So I went off of nuts and seeds as part of the elimination diet that I did. And I was grateful that when I added back sesame seeds, I did not have any reaction. I watched for about 4 days. So that's something that I was able to include in my food plan going forward. But I just wanted to caution our listeners that sometimes these things that we think are so healthy, like nuts and seeds, may actually be triggering some reactions in your body.
It's interesting to tune into that. For me, it's just never been that way. And I appreciate you bringing my attention to that, of course. And there are so many people who I have really good friends who are actually on the plant paradox who have no nuts and seeds at all. And they're doing very, very well. So that's another consideration. But I want to go back to trauma with you. I think it's important. There is one of the blurbs on your book that really struck me from Dr. Paul Conti, and he says there are powerful protective armies within us, but trauma can confuse them. And I realize that we're closing the loop on this conversation. I think it's important. What would you say about that? I know what I think and feel in my own body. But I feel like it's important for you, having written this book, that there is potentially a cure for what ails those with autoimmune situations. What does that mean, that trauma confuses the protective armies within us?
Yeah, the body is magnificent. And there are also some ways in which we can become dysregulated when that trauma signature is living on inside of our cells. And I believe that's what Paul Conti is referring to. And when you look at the stress response in the body, and you look at that alarm that goes off, maybe as a result of childhood trauma or something that occurred to you as an adult, the microtraumas that you talked about in the workplace, what we know is that there are 4 different systems that are especially vulnerable, and we call it the PINE network. And the PINE stands for psycho, our psychological system; immuno, our immune system; neuro, which is our neurological system; and then endo, which is our endocrinological system. So those 4 systems are the ones that are the most vulnerable. And what I see in the clients that I take care of is that some of us have more vulnerability with one system than the other. So for me, I always thought it was my endocrine system that was the most vulnerable. I seemed to kind of crank up my cortisol or turn it down too low. It's just part of the dysregulation that I've been tracking in my system for the past 20 years. And it's at quite a stable place now, but I know for most of my life it's not been so stable. And then for some folks, it's really their immune system. And as you know, Elena, about 70% of your immune system is in your gut. It's right beneath the top layer of your gastrointestinal tract. And so it can become really sensitive to the stress that you're experiencing. We know the stress response, which starts off with, your amygdala, the part of your brain that senses threat and danger, that can send a signal to another part of your brain and cause the release of something called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. And CRH, if you're cranking that out a lot of the time, it's poking holes in your gut. And when you poke holes in the gut, you then allow that immune system to start to be exposed to things that it's not normally exposed to. So that can kick off this state of confusion. We've got these systems of balance, these powerful protective armies, like especially in our immune system, but it can become dysregulated. It can become confused. So when you're making antibodies against normal tissues, such as we see in so many women who are postpartum, who develop thyroid conditions and Hashimoto's thyroiditis when they're in the postpartum phase, or in perimenopause, where we see an uptick in the diagnosis of autoimmune conditions, those triggers are what can lead to this confusion. So trauma is one of the triggers, and it's, a critical one that, as you said, is a through line of the book. And it's also not the only one.
Thank you for that. It's really helpful to just have this conversation about the various possible causes of all of these discomforts and real situations that people are dealing with. I think the last question I would like to ask, any particular other cases aside from Larry that are standing out that might be relevant for our listener today?
Well, when I think back to when I first started practicing yoga with you, before we became connected as friends, Elena, it reminds me of a woman who was in her 40s that I met through a yoga class, maybe 6-7 years ago. So yoga is a big part of my life. And when I met this woman, we became friendly. I got to know her a bit as a friend. And then she came to me during the pandemic and said, listen, I'm having these intense pains in my elbows and I'm having trouble teaching yoga. I've got fatigue and I'm just really struggling. And I went to my primary care doctor. She was going to a nurse practitioner who ordered some testing and said, your rheumatoid factor is really elevated. Sounds like you've got rheumatoid arthritis. Let's send you to a rheumatologist. She also had high levels of inflammation. So, as measured with high sensitivity C-reactive protein, that particular blood test was really elevated. And so she got sent to a rheumatologist. She's got good insurance, but she had to wait about 6 months to see this guy. And while she was waiting for that 6 months, she reached out to me and said, Sara, what else could I be doing? And so we started talking, and this story emerged, Elena, that was so profound. She said that in the previous 2 years, she discovered that her husband was having an affair with her best friend.
Oh, gosh.
And that betrayal was devastating. Devastating. I know this trauma kicked off exactly what Paul Conti is talking about. We've got these powerful protective armies within us, but the dysregulation of trauma can confuse them. So within 2 years, she had this self-attack in her joints. And we started to do the things that you and I have been talking about. We did an elimination diet. We started doing microbiome restoration. She already had a really solid yoga and meditation practice. She layered on some psychedelic assisted therapy just to process and start to resolve some of this trauma that was in her tissues. And by the time she made it to the rheumatologist 6 months later, he said to her, glad you're feeling better, but here's the medication. This is what we use to treat rheumatoid arthritis. It's what you have.
Right.
But he also sent her to get an ultrasound. And the ultrasonographer said to her, I got to tell you, I don't see any problems here in your joints. It looks like your joints are really healthy. And so this woman ended up not taking the medication. I'm not saying, that that's what people should do. You got to do this in consultation with your clinician. But I just want to make this point that often trauma can be this trigger for your immune system getting confused and not protecting you the way that it's meant to. And so it's not that resolving the trauma is going to get rid of 100% of your problems, but I think it's an important part of the healing process, along with these other things, like all the lifestyle redesign, all the things that have been shown to make a difference.
Yeah. I think that's a very relatable story for a lot of us, and I'm grateful that you shared it. I want to encourage our listener to go and order your book, The Autoimmune Cure. It is a wealth of resources, ideas. Literally, just keep it open on the table so that you can reference it all the time and remind yourself of why you're making this choice over that one, why you're choosing to take an extra 30 minutes to make sure you're getting all the colors into your meal or your smoothie. I am going to hang up with you, and I'm going to make a smoothie with 1,000 colors of the rainbow. I'm really excited about it because I don't really feel like eating food right now, but I do feel like nourishing myself, and that is exactly what the doctor just ordered. I want to thank you so much. Is there anything else that you feel called to talk about? We do have a little bit of time left if you would like to touch on anything else whatsoever.
Well, first, I want to just tell you how grateful I am to you, Elena. I don't know if this is okay to say publicly, but you've been a sponsor for me as I went through the challenge of a divorce over the previous year. And you've been just so generous. And, you know, a big part of the experience of trauma and toxic stress is that you have allies, that you have people you can talk to. The text that I sent you at all hours of, you know, kind of the latest thing that I was up against. And you just had such words of wisdom for me. And I feel like that sense of community, that sense of connection is such a healing force, especially when you're faced with mysterious illnesses. And the last thing I want to say is that when you're struggling in this way and you're not getting answers and you're not getting solutions, you're not getting the treatments that you feel aligned with from the conventional medical system, I just want to say so clearly and maybe a little more softly that it's so much easier to solve this challenge of autoimmunity than it is to live with the misery of not knowing and not feeling like you're empowered to make the lifestyle changes that can really help to, as Paul Conti described, get your powerful protective armies back on your side. So that difficulty that you might be in right now is so much worse than the solution. I just think that's an important, hopeful note to end on.
Yeah, that's a beautiful one. I mean, and I think you and I are good examples of that. We had to take ourselves on. And for me, it took years to figure out what was going on with my gut and sort it out and then pile on menopause. And that took some time to figure out what was needed there, how I needed to approach my body and my practices. So, yeah, I feel that. And I'll say, too, the text thread remains ajar for you, no matter what the hour. If I am awake, I am there. It is a privilege to help my friends. It really is. And I appreciate your trust, actually. So thank you. What a pleasure to be with you again. Thank you so much for your hard work. I am so looking forward to seeing you soon, I hope. And congratulations on this really wonderful, epic, groundbreaking book. The Autoimmune Cure is out. Please go get your copy. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.